What do dogs, ginger, voting, and coyotes have in common? They all taught me how to be a good neighbor. I promise I'll explain. One of the things that I had hoped to do during sabbatical was to get to know my surroundings a little bit better. I wanted to visit places in Dallas that I hadn't been and to establish stronger roots in my neighborhood. We moved into a new house in February of 2021, still in the thick of the pandemic, and so I didn't get a chance to connect with my neighbors in the way that I might have in different times. The quest to answer who is my neighbor was assisted greatly by an energetic puppy joining our family earlier this year, who needs at least 2 walks a day and believes that everyone is or should be her friend. All of a sudden, Indigo and I started meeting our neighbors. We met neighbors we'd never seen before, and I got to know neighbors on a deeper level who I'd only waved at in passing. Those of you with dogs know that you often get to know your neighboring dogs' names before you get to know your neighboring people's names. Nonetheless, it's a helpful entry point for conversation. Indigo's favorite neighbor is Grizz, the 125-pound Bernese mountain dog next door. They've been playing together like the best of friends since Indigo was less than 20 pounds. It's quite a sight. It was through Indigo and Grizz that I met and learned about my neighbors, their children and grandchildren, their hobbies and their church and their college days. It was through Grizz that my neighbor discovered one of his former A&M football teammates lives just down the block. It's a small world. One day, I got a text from my neighbor asking for some ginger. Fresh, candied, ground, or paste, I asked. I didn't hear back, and so I gathered them all up and went and knocked on their door. They decided to use the ground ginger, and I never did get that jar back, but it's okay. It felt good to help in this small, seemingly insignificant way. A few weeks later, I texted them, "Do you have a chainsaw I can borrow?" We were doing some yard work, and I didn't have all the right tools. Minutes later, my neighbor and his dog showed up on my front porch with a chainsaw. The exchange and the support has continued and taken a variety of forms. This is our version of borrowing the sugar, like in this morning's reading. We are very different people, but we're neighbors. The TV personality, Presbyterian minister, and neighborhood builder, Mr. Fred Rogers, said, "All of us at some time or other need help. Whether we're giving or receiving help, each one of us has something valuable to bring to this world. That's one of the things that connects us as neighbors. In our own way, each one of us is a giver and a receiver." When my elderly neighbor across the street had a sprinkler pipe burst and no one was answering the door, I found his daughter on Facebook and sent her a message. It was through this exchange that I learned that my neighbor and his late wife, both of whom played for the Dallas Symphony, were married at a Unitarian Universalist church in Ohio. During primary season this spring, 2 different candidates' yard signs just showed up on my front porch. It took me a while to figure it out, but another neighbor across the street, who guessed our political leanings by our current "In This House We Believe" and "I Love First Unitarian Church" yard signs, thought that we might want to add to our collection. And her guess was right. It's amazing to me how many people have commented on our "In This House We Believe," "Black Lives Matter," "Love is Love," etc. yard sign. I've started thinking of it as another way of being a good neighbor, of letting people know, I see you and your humanity, and you are welcome here. Sometimes, however, our neighbors are not who we want them to be. As many of you know, coyotes are a common sight in Dallas neighborhoods, especially those with green belts and creeks. This past May, just a couple miles from where I live, a coyote attacked a 2-year-old playing on his front porch. An older sibling and the mother were nearby, and the mother had to pull this large, mangy, aggressive coyote off her toddler. This incident set off a neighborhood-wide hunt involving Dallas Animal Services, the game warden, and outraged parents wielding cell phone cameras and, in some cases, guns, one of which that ultimately led to 3 coyotes being killed in the area, one of which is believed to be the one that attacked the little boy. For days, people were posting in our neighborhood social media groups about coyote sightings near playgrounds and in yards. Parents and schools kept children inside. Everyone was looking for someone to blame, and the city scrambled to respond to residents outraged by the lack of response to earlier reports. The problem was not that coyotes live in Dallas, though. The problem is that these coyotes were, shall we say, out of covenant. It's one way of putting it. Human neighbors were having trouble distinguishing between their harmless coyote neighbors and those coyotes who were not living peaceably alongside us, but were instead on the attack. If there can be any silver lining to this horrific incident, it's that people learned how to be better neighbors to coyotes, how to live alongside them, and when to call out inappropriate and dangerous behavior. Fear is not limited to our relationship with our coyote neighbors. Many of us are fearful of our human neighbors, especially those with different political or religious viewpoints. Our neighbors are not always who we want them to be. But the answer is not to surround ourselves exclusively with neighbors who think and look like us. It's more challenging than that. The answer is to love your neighbor as yourself. In Christianity, it's called the Great Commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. When Jesus shares this commandment, a lawyer asks him, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus responds, as he often does, with a parable. A Jewish traveler is stripped of his clothing, beaten, and left half dead on the side of the road. A Jewish priest passes by, and then a Levite, but both avoid the man and continue on their way. Then a Samaritan sees the traveler, and although Samaritans and Jews are enemies, the Good Samaritan stops and helps the man. Even our enemies are our neighbors, and we are called to love them as we love ourselves. Every major religion, including Unitarian Universalism, calls us to rise to this challenge. For us, it's rooted in the belief that every person, whoever they are and whatever they believe, has undeniable worth and dignity. And whether we want to be or not, we are all connected as part of an interdependent web. If we're really honest, many of us do love our neighbors, even our enemies, as ourselves. We hate our imperfections, we hate the ways in which we are or have less than others, and we transfer that to our neighbors, not fully recognizing or embracing the worth and dignity that we both possess and the ways in which we are interconnected through our shared humanity. Barbara Brown Taylor, an Episcopal priest and religion professor, writes in her book, Holy Envy, Finding God in the Faith of Others, about a field trip that she took with a group of students in her world religions class. She writes, once at the end of a field trip to the Atlanta Masjid of Al-Islam, the imam ended his meeting with students by saying, "Our deepest desire is not that you become Muslim, but that you become the best Christian, the best Jew, the best person you can be. In the name of God, the most gracious and most merciful, thank you for coming." And then he was gone, leaving me with a fresh case of holy envy. I could do that, I thought. I could speak from the heart of my faith, wishing others well at the heart of theirs, including those who had no name for what got them through the night. It might mean taking down some fences, but turf was no longer the reigning metaphor. I was not imagining 2 separate yards and neighbors leaning over a shared boundary. I was imagining a single reservoir of living water with 2 people looking into it. One might have been a Muslim and the other a Christian, but there was nothing in their faces to tell me that. All I saw were two human beings looking into deep waters that did not belong to either of them, reflecting back to them the truth that they were not alone. Barbara Brown Taylor's image of a shared reservoir of living water reminds me of the important work that our church has done with Friends for Good, an interfaith program that we founded that brings together Unitarian Universalists, Muslims, Jews, and evangelical Christians to get to know our religious neighbors, to build friendships, and to do good together. We don't have to agree on everything to borrow the sugar from one another. And the connections that we build strengthen the fabric of our society far beyond the dinners that we share together. Another challenging layer on top of all of this, which adds to the difficulty of being a good neighbor, is that the pandemic has taught us in many ways to be scared of our neighbors, that they may be vectors of illness, that they may think differently about masking or vaccines, and so we need to keep our distance both physically and socially. While COVID has presented some real risks in this regard, I keep asking myself, how do we overcome this? How do we reconnect after the isolation of the pandemic? It doesn't require us to exchange fist bumps for handshakes or waves for hugs. There are so many ways to connect with our neighbors. We can engage in the giving and receiving of sugar, of ginger, of chainsaws and drills. Such exchanges remind us that we're not on our own, but that we can depend on others. We can get to know our neighbors. As much as we dismiss and downplay small talk, there is power in it. I learned this on my walks with Indigo, getting to know the day-to-day thoughts and events in my neighbors' lives, which led to conversations about deeper matters. We can support our neighbors by voting. We have some significant opportunities this fall to vote with our neighbors in mind. Neighbors near and far with whom we share a lot or very little in common, and especially to vote with the most marginalized in mind. I remember voting in the primaries last spring and thinking, for one of the first times, actually, how good it felt to do my civic duty and to vote for candidates that I knew would advocate for the well-being and growth of young people and of communities of color. This is no time for any of us to be standing on the sidelines. Our voices and our votes matter a lot and will literally determine the trajectory of many of our neighbors' lives. We can also connect with our neighbors by being ourselves and inviting them to be themselves as well. I remember at one of my first Friends for Good dinners, coming out to the imam of the mosque that we were partnering with. He said something to me about bringing home some leftover food for my husband, and I said to him, actually, I have a wife. Her name is Erin. He paused and he said, oh, then you must bring some food home for her. I decided in that moment to be myself, not knowing whether I would be accepted and certainly not expecting it to change any viewpoint that he might hold, but trusting that to be a good neighbor, I must be myself and invite him to be himself as well. Paraphrasing the imam speaking to Barbara Brown Taylor's world religion students, my desire is not that my neighbors become exactly like me, but that they become the best people they can be. We do this right here in our congregation. We don't all share the same beliefs, but we're looking into that shared pool of living water together, and we're doing so in covenant. Unitarian Universalist minister Fred Meir says, we are accountable not just to each other, to some contract of agreement, but also to that journey of faith that can by its nature and by our indwelling nature transform us. Because when we walk faithfully together, a sort of alchemy takes over, melting our stubborn hearts into greater wisdom, opening our stuck minds to the multiplicity of truth, moving us into greater harmony, not in opinion or experience, but in spirit. Covenant, he said, is the gift of leaning into each other's arms and together leaning into the everlasting arms. Arms that hold and comfort, and arms that also push us forward to take that next leap into justice. It all starts, though, with turning to our neighbor. It gains traction with our curiosity about their story. It gets deeper as we discover the subtler nuances of our own story. It goes the full Monty when we together lay bare the pile of hurts along the way, and it clothes itself in glory when we find connection and healing and hope in new patterns of community that make space for us all. Maybe the beloved community is just this practice, right here, right now, of encountering the holy in each other and striving and failing and loving and celebrating over and over again. Finding new circles of practice beyond our own communities and doing that over and over again. Muir describes this practice of building beloved community as one that begins here in our religious community and then finds new circles of practice beyond. Here, church, is where we practice being human, being good neighbors, and being weavers of a stronger social fabric that we hope and pray will extend beyond any fences that surround us. Build me a bridge over the stream to my neighbor's house, says the poet Ian Crichton Smith. Oh, ring of snowdrops, spread wherever you want, and you also, blackbird, sing across the fences. My neighbor, if the rain falls on you, let it fall on me also from the same black cloud that does not recognize gates. So throw open the gates, jump over the fences, tear down the walls, borrow the sugar, and together let us gaze into those deep waters that do not belong to either of us, reflecting back to each other the truth that we are not alone. May it be so. Amen.